Hi everyone, and welcome to Game Weapon Concept Fundamentals. In this course, we're going to be combining different visual ingredients to create a compelling fantasy weapon design. I'm also going to introduce you to using ZBrush for concept art so that we can enhance our final concept and its presentation. But first, in this module, we're going to be diving into our design brief, some reference gathering, shape language understanding, and some thumbnails. So the first thing that we need to know about our project is exactly what it is that we're making. Well, the thing we want to understand is we're creating a weapon for swords and shovels, Pluralsight's game dev learning path. This is important because this gives us context for the kind of style and design sense that we should utilize when we're creating this piece and the world that it's going to inhabit. We've looked at this previously in my last course, Game Prop Concept Fundamentals, where we created a chest. Its design sense came from the environment a lot more significantly. Now, if you want to understand what some of our basic shape language is for this world and its style, you can check out that course. However, in this one, we're going to start going into something a little bit more advanced. But because this is swords and shovels, we wanted to make something that is a bit more of an interesting kind of weapon. So, the weapon in this case is going to be a shovel. The thing is, a shovel by itself does not exactly look like a weapon. We want to have something that's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more aggressive looking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine a shovel with a sword. The shape language that we're going to use is making sure that our shovel ends up being sort of a secondary element to our weapon. First and foremost, we're creating a weapon that happens to look like a shovel. The next thing that we want to do is start finding out what the shape language is of either of these things so that we can continue and start creating something that's really visually compelling. The first thing I recommend that you do anytime you're trying to figure out what the shape language is of one object or various objects is to simply start a Google search. So in this case, for example, shovel is the first thing that we can search for. Now, of course, in this case, we don't necessarily need some of the other information that we get, such as Wikipedia pages, but we do want the shape language, so we'll go to images, and we can simply see there are a ton of images of shovels and their general shapes. And these are pretty useful. These will give us a very iconic understanding of what a shovel's iconography is. Its silhouette, as we can see here. That is really, really useful for us. The silhouette is one of the most important things when it comes to understanding an object's shape language. But there may be a little bit more detail that we want to get from this, so let's also search for antique. I find when trying to search for sort of fantasy kinds of objects, that antique tends to work really well when trying to find certain kinds of objects. So let's add that. So antique shovel. So now we're starting to find a lot more interesting structures in what we're building here. Not something that's too modern, but we can find things with bolts and other elements that fit our style quite nicely. Also, if we see an image that we like and we want to see more things like it, I recommend a little used function that's inside of Google called Search by Image. Now, you can access this if you're using Chrome by also right-clicking and going to Search Google for Image. That can be really useful because when you search this, we'll get a new tab opening up, and it'll give us visually similar images that we can search from. On top of that, it tends to know what the object may have been because Google's pretty smart, and so it knows that it's a shovel, so it's giving us all these different types of images of shovels. So that's great. We've got a lot of reference to work with for these shovels. So we can bookmark them or catalog them in some way just to make sure that we've got these for reference purposes. We can't necessarily use them into our concepts directly because there's going to be copyright issues. But at the very least, we can keep them and check them for later just to compare shapes and contrast the elements that are there. Now on top of that, we also need things like swords. So let's search for sword. Now the problem is swords, that tends to give us something that's a little bit less ideal. A lot of these shapes are already fantasy swords. Now, that's fine, but that's not always what we want to work with, because sometimes fantasy designs are a little bit derivative. They're kind of playing off of each other. They're doing things that we don't always necessarily want. They can tend to be very useful, but we may want to get a little bit more specific. So we could start searching. Let's try that same one as before. Antique. So the nice thing about antique is we do tend to get real swords as opposed to fantasy swords. So we're starting with a shape language set in reality. Now, in some cases, these are maybe not quite the same style. We're probably not working with Indian style swords. We probably want something medieval. So again, we could just click medieval and start finding some of these kinds of swords. So there's some shapes here that work really well and could help us and work pretty decently. But we may want to start adjusting a little bit more. Maybe we want more detailed images here. So I'm actually just going to take off the medieval part here, or actually let's take off antique and search for auction. Auction websites tend to produce very, very high resolution images for us. They can be incredibly powerful, and if you click on any one of these, it'll take you into a new scene which will start to show you everything else that may exist on that website and on that different sort of auction. This is incredibly useful for us because high resolution images like this can give us a lot of information, and you can even go to the auction page itself, which can sometimes show you even more information. It's important and valuable to have a set of images that you're going to be working with when you're doing your concept work, when you're developing out an idea. Because when you have certain kinds of interesting detailed images, it'll start to inspire the kinds of shapes that you may want to use or start to repeat in your designs. It'll also give you a good understanding of exactly what does a shovel look like, what are the key structures to it, and what does a sword look like, what are the key structures to that, and what makes things look a little bit more fancy or not. So for example, these are some images that I've gotten from photobash.org, which is a website where you can purchase royalty-free photo reference packs and actually use them in your concepts if you desire. These different weapons are all very, very different. They all have a similar kind of structure to them, but I like to look through all these different ones because each one's going to have a kind of a different setup to it, a different structure, something else that's kind of compelling about it. Some of them wrap around in different ways. So these ones, for example, are kind of like sabers. They kind of cover the hand a little bit more on their hilt. The hilt has a different kind of structure to it that's really interesting. Some of them are from different regions, so their structure changes. And it's really nice to look at these up in detail, up close. These kind of pieces can give you good information and sort of ideas to kind of copy, straight up copy. The fact of the matter is when we're trying to create two different things, we don't want to get too fancy in our idea. I want this to look like a sword. So I need to copy sword structures. If I try to make this look like a shovel plus a sword plus a gun plus something else, then I'm going to have to copy and be really obvious with what those shapes are. So even just details like these hilts, these are really useful for future concepting methods because I can start to figure out stuff up close. Things like this are really, really powerful because I can start to make it look older or maybe a little bit more less fancy. For example, here, this is a very simple hilt. I can work off of that. Now, things I want to avoid is potentially getting too fancy with some of the designs. I don't want to necessarily look at the blades too much on here, as much as the general rest of the structure. So now that I've got those things to work with, I know what a shovel should generally look like, I know what a sword should look like, I can start to build things out a little bit more with my thumbnail phase, which we will watch in our next clip.